We started a journey about 6 weeks ago, and the journey has been this discussion about anxiety, panic, trauma, fear, and essentially the roles that it plays in our lives. And I've called it the wolfpack series. And the reason for that is essentially because at the core of the way that we deal with it in shadow work is we essentially get to the point where we understand that each one of these things, being a wolf, being anxiety, being panicked ideas, are wolves that need to be called out. They essentially haunt you. They howl you down. And in the very old shamanic story, if you're walking through the forest, these wolves of fear essentially hunt you down, and they get more and more brave. And eventually you're like the scared child running across the crisp snow while they call friends. And the analogy is really important because at the core of what it is that we've been working through is this idea that we can get to the point and we can actually eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, perhaps out of courage, perhaps a combination of the two, we can turn around one day and we can actually face the wolf or run back at the wolf. And as many of you know, because many of you have done altered states and trance processes and plant medicine processes, there nearly isn't a fear in the world that doesn't dissolve when you actually go for it directly. It is always far bigger in the shadows. So that's why it's been called the Wolfpack series. And we took quite a deep dive last time into the way that fear gets trapped somatically inside our bodies. And it's a really powerful thing to realize, especially, for instance, there's a few distinctions that we really clearly brought out that are absolutely fascinating when you work with people such as myself. I don't mean working with me. I mean, I also have a lot of anxiety issues and things. And it's fascinating to realize that one of the reasons that we really battle is because we essentially do not want to feel a feeling. And in not wanting to feel that feeling, the feeling doesn't flow. So it's such a deep irony. It's like in being afraid to feel fear, I often feel a lot of fear. In being afraid to feel alone, I always feel alone. I'm not saying that the alone is mine. I'm just giving you examples. And it's a fascinating thing. And the other thing that was really, really powerful that we slowly developed this idea is the fact that a lot of suffering, because I mean, the type of people that come into a room like this and sit down and have this discussion are the type of people that to me are facing what I call an initiation. And to me, fear is the ultimate initiation. It is essentially the shamanic path of love, because once you can face fear, and not a form of fear, not the smoke and mirrors of fear, because another thing that we dived into was just how many faces fear shows you, but it is actually only fear and the helpless feeling that comes with it that we truly fear. And in this initiation, it's the path of love is what lies on the other side of it. So the type of people that come into a room like this tend to know it on a very, very personal level. So we develop essentially opinions about these feelings. And I know this sounds really crazy, but if you just think about it carefully, you'll realize that a lot of your suffering is what we call an interference pattern. And what that means is you have an opinion about a feeling, or you feel a way towards the way you feel. So an example for me is I become so frustrated when my anxiety becomes overwhelming that I actually have an emotional response towards my anxiety. So I actually become irritated, angry, frustrated towards the fact that I have those, that anxiety, and it essentially causes this interference pattern. You see the same thing in people that I work with that have extreme anger or any form of what you could call extremes of emotion. Is a person that is angry about the fact that they're angry. They're angry at the fact that they just got so angry. They're angry about the fact that they can't get so angry. And I want you to just identify whatever powerful emotion it is you deal with in your life, how many thoughts and opinions and feelings you have about that core feeling or initiation. And of course, deconstructing this is quite a journey, but it's a very personal journey that only you can take. But it's quite a journey because we realize, I mean, if we had to, because we're not going to repeat everything we've done in the first 3 hours, you essentially are talking about a mighty path of self-love to get to the point where you realize that you are perfect as you are, and that whatever you are feeling and expressing is exactly what you need to anchor that thing into this world. So this talk essentially has been called Cerberus, and Cerberus is a mythological three-headed creature who, depending on who wrote and who described him, this mythological creature was essentially a wolf/dog with 3 heads. And he essentially protected, he was the guardian of the gate of the underworld between what you could call the normal world and the underworld. And the reason why we have used that name is essentially what I am suggesting in your journey, in this mighty initiation that you need to, that you almost, you know, if you had to be fair, you could say that you're almost forced onto. The people that go onto this journey of self-exploration through anxiety, fear, panic, trauma, it's almost as though from the conscious mind, you have no option. It's like you are forced into a corner and you either lose your marbles or start to crack or get completely lost in addiction, which is a big part of this conversation, or we are forced to actually make huge changes and ask really big questions. So in some ways it can be frustrating that we feel like this path is thrust upon us, but on a greater spectrum, when one spends time alone or in prayer, or as a little bit of understanding sinks in, you begin to realize that this was your plan all along. And I have such a special place in my heart for people that are facing fear directly. So why the 3-headed dog, and why talking about this guardian at the gate? Well, it's very simple. I'm essentially saying that when this initiation is done, you would have become the guardian at the gate. And why there are 3 doors, there are actually many doors, but regarding us as a human being interfacing with our bodies and our souls, we have 3 areas that are of complete importance in this conversation of initiation. And the first area, we've had this discussion, and it's what we're going to be talking about tonight, is the mind. And even the fact that I pointed my head is a little bit silly, because when you go down the path of what the mind actually is, whoa, things get weird. But let's just, for this intents and purpose, call this the mind. And then the other path of power is the actual solar plexus. And this is the other place where Cerberus has to protect from the underworld. And I don't mean this in the underworld in something I'm trying to scare you and bring some narrative into your life. It's an archetype that I want to build for you. I mean, what would it be to be the guardian of your mind? Would literally mean that certain thoughts and ideas can no longer penetrate you. And that is our focus for this evening. And then we spoke about the solar plexus. The solar plexus is your seat of power, your seat of will. So it is where your sheer power comes from. And I'm sure that we all know what it feels like in your solar plexus when you are losing the war to crippling anxiety and to fear and to doubt. And then in the middle of that, so I know you can't see me, so there's my stomach, there's my head, there's the heart zone. And incredibly enough, it just makes sense. The heart zone is the thing that is meant to connect the power center with the thought center. And it is these 3 areas that in mythology and in a lot of history and in a lot of religions will get tested through an initiation. And I want to give you an example. They used to use the word initiate about 3,500 years ago in the Neoplatonic eras, and even Hermetics and many schools of what they call ancient thought. And what's incredible about this conversation is essentially that even in shamanism in South America, they have similar stories. And that is, for instance, that you would have to face the initiation of the mind to become an initiate. And that would essentially look like extreme anxiety, facing insanity, completely doubting one's reality, onslaught of thoughts that would absolutely rip into you, that you almost were at war and no one else could tell. And that's the one we're talking about tonight. The initiation of the heart, so that you can identify for yourself if perhaps you have gone through it already, is called the piercing of the heart. And he's spoken about, just in what I can find, I found it in over 25 traditions. They speak about the piercing of the heart as an ultimate initiation. Rumi often spoke about the fact that, you know, like many poets, that the cracks would either open you wider to love and to light, or you would essentially shut down and begin to die a little. So the piercing of the heart, according to legend, would be the first time you truly have your heart broken or you are betrayed. And it usually has an element of betrayal. And what's incredible in the story is that the betrayal is usually by someone, as I said, that you love very deeply. And some people believe, even though that person becomes an enemy in this life, that you hold a soul contract that you've been running for thousands of years, where you essentially initiate one another. Now, I can't attest to whether that's true or not, and I'm not yet to bring in a belief system. And then we talk about the initiation of the solar plexus, the center point of all addictions. It is there whether you feel powerful. It is there whether you decide if you can get out of your bed in the morning. It is there where you feel life desperation flooding from you, or you feel passion and will and cosmic fire burning in your belly. And if you think about a lot of our very addictive substances in Vedic traditions, or in the Far East, if you go 2,000 to 4,000 years ago into ancient texts and Sanskrit, they call that the spinning disc. The spinning disc, that the faster it spins in the correct direction, the more seat of power you have. And it's very interesting if you think about things like alcohol. You drink alcohol and it gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling, and then essentially the almost relaxation of the anxiety for a short while, and then, as many of us know, spikes our anxiety even higher in the long run. And that's just one example of how these addictions play into what it is we're feeling, because we essentially really want that reprieve. So I've built us a little bit of an overview in the first 20 minutes of where we are, of these initiations and these stations. And what's incredible is, if you go, because this conversation has been very shamanic and mostly Neoplatonic, but if you were to go to, as I said, into the Vedic traditions, you will notice that when the Kundalini rises, or the energy of life rises from the base or sacral center, every single energy point that it hits involves an initiation. It's absolutely mind-blowing. So let's say, for instance, your solar plexus gets, the Kundalini arrives to your solar plexus, it will magnify everything within that chakra. So now I'm using a different belief system, but what's incredible is they all teach us the same things. And now what would that be? That would be, for instance, the initiation of the solar plexus is usually an Kundalini rises in, if you were to using an Eastern tradition, it could only rise at a certain speed because of the initiations that you would have to face at each level. And what I really love is, we build an analogy here. In shamanic culture, we tend to teach that it is a complete bastardization of spirituality, that to expand your energy and to become more powerful means that you should be in love and light. Essentially, you start to integrate bigger and bigger pieces of what you could call the chaos and the fabric, or light and love and darkness. And what I love is if you go then away from shamanism and you move into what we can essentially call, let's call it just Eastern uh, knowledge for now, there's almost the same idea, just differently explained, because they're saying just because the light is rising and just because you're expanding doesn't mean that the things you have to face do not become greater. And you can imagine as it hits each energy center. And it's quite incredible. I don't know if any of you have ever sat with some really incredible swamis. I sat with a swami once that could actually, just by you telling exactly what was going on with you, they can tell exactly where that kundalini is blocking and where it's not. And it's a fascinating thing. So this is to not put that into your space. This is to just get us present for a second that the crisis that is in your life could very well be the thing that your soul is doing absolutely correctly. And that's a difficult thing for us as human beings. We like to believe that our struggle is something that we've just done wrong and everything's gone awry. So, yeah, it's an incredible thing. If we look at the modern world, anxieties are an amazing part of life, and they are becoming, if anything, I would say, even more prevalent. And in everyday life, anxieties, I think you could probably put them in two categories. There would be the tangible anxieties, and then there would be the intangible. And the tangible would be the ones where they're no less frustrating, but it would be things like worrying about money, um, worrying about your children. So very tangible, but they really do still draw on us, and they do create a lot of chaos in our lives. But where the problems really come in is in the intangible anxieties. And the reason for that is we are not even sure what it is that we are afraid of. And that is where archetypes and certain things can become very powerful. But an example, for instance, is, as we discussed in the first two talks, one of the things you need to do when you're trying to help someone with panic disorder is every single person has this deep-seated fear of what it is they think is going to happen. And the first time or the last time it almost happened, they create a blueprint. And that blueprint, their brain, their body, and their everything promises themselves they will never, ever return to that place. So an example would be perhaps the last time you had a panic attack, or whether yours is based on something else. And in that moment, perhaps you thought you were going to die. And now you have this idea that every time panic and anxiety gets to a certain point, that you are literally facing your own mortality. Mine specific, which is a very common one as well, which has morphed and changed over the years, was insanity. I actually thought I was losing my mind. And I became so afraid of that, that the more afraid I became, the more I thought insanity was on my doorstep. So there's this deep, dark belief in the background, and it's different for everyone. I don't know if any of you have ever noticed, when you are in a deep state of anxiety, if you think about really big things about life, it can get scary. So, for instance, if you're in an amazing space sitting on a beach, you can think about God and things like that, and it's absolutely fine. And why this discussion of the war for your mind becomes interesting is, if you do not understand how your mind works and you're in that deep state of anxiety and you start thinking about your life and God, and you'll realize this incredible existential dread that comes into everything. So essentially, one of the things we have to teach ourselves is to not ask the big questions when we are essentially falling out of the proverbial aeroplane. But what I mean about these tangible and intangible anxieties is that most people, which is what brings them into a conversation like this, actually have no idea why they're anxious. Everybody has very normal anxieties. Everybody gets scared. Everybody feels a little bit too wound up sometimes. And some people just have that element of anxiety that would have to go as far as being called a tormentor, or as we could say, an element would be a gift, I guess. So as we move on, we've connected very powerfully to this idea that there is only fear that you fear. Now, that's a really, really difficult thing for someone, and I'm not going to go through it all now. And if you want a little bit of, deeper understanding on that, you could always speak to me at another time, or you could watch the other actual talks. But I want you to just consider, let's give fear an archetype. Think about how it manifests in those three zones, right? You get chest pain. You feel so disempowered in your solar plexus. Your mind is running. You sweat. You become warm. You become uncomfortable. Your skin feels strange. You feel vertigo. You begin to experience space and time differently because of how powerful the adrenal systems are. Your bladder can often spill. Your stomach can change. I mean, guys, I shared with you that a lot of psychology textbooks call it one of the most uncomfortable states you can go into without permanent damage. So I want us to just really begin with one of the biggest things that is difficult to deal with when you're trying to help someone with this process is you first need them to get them to realize that this could just be fear. Now, why would that be important? Because if you think about it, people that deal with very high levels of anxiety, not because they're weak, all have an element of hypochondria. And the only reason for that is because you're desperately trying to find a reason for why you feel so uncomfortable. I mean, you essentially do not feel safe in your own home, being your biodome. And to obsessively look for an explanation is something that is very, very expected. So one of the first things is to realize that it could just be fear. And most people don't realize how powerful fear in its purest essence, as this dark wolf that's calling and howling out to you. And if you ever go put your face close to it and see how powerful this emanating thing actually is, you realize that I might just be dealing with fear. Why this is such an important part is the second thing you would do is realize just fear is a silly statement, because fear was considered the greatest soul initiation in many of the stories that we've touched upon. So just fear is a silly statement. It's fear. But I want you to just consider that this might be the thing that you take on this lifetime that is your goal for this entire incarnation. What a magnificent thing. And how would you know? Well, how much of a part of your life has anxiety been? Is this thing tormenting you? Do you feel the need to get to the bottom of this thing? This thing is calling you. And on the other side of it sits an unconditional love and a guardian at each gate. As you come through this thing, I want you to just understand how powerful. Do you know, for me to still be sitting here in front of you, I had to go so deep into the workings of my mind, not intellectually. I had to go through stages where I watched every single thought. And that's a discussion that we'll get slightly into now. So to have this conversation about what it is that you could be dealing with being fear, we're going to focus on the role that the mind, in the next 30 minutes, that the mind plays in fear. The first question we'd really have to ask ourselves, I suppose, is what is the mind? I mean, the thing about language is, as you know, linguistics doesn't ever give us a true grasp of reality. But when we say mind, we tend to be thinking about the brain. And it's an incredible thing, because to this day, no one knows how consciousness is produced from a scientific perspective. It's a known fact that we don't even know if the consciousness comes from the brain. That's quite an extraordinary thing. If you ever watched this film, DMT, Spirit Molecule, and that one lady who's one of the top neurologists in the world from BSc Berkeley, and she drank ayahuasca, and the whole night it basically explained to this brain surgeon how consciousness actually creates the brain, which is the complete opposite to what we believe. But I think that the conversation of what the mind actually is, a lot of people, if you were to go and study, because we're talking about Neoplatism, if you look back 3,000-4,000 years in a lot of where these sacred texts come from, you notice this idea. There's two things. That first of all, your mind is not contained here. It is your entire body that is feeling and thinking, which is really not hard to believe. But what's really, really interesting is we have a completely different idea nowadays of how separate we are to everything around us. And this is an important conversation for how it is we deal with anxiety. If you look at Hermetics and if you look at things like the Kabbalion, you see, for instance, that if you imagine the branches of your mind and the universe of synapses, now guys, this was 3,000 years ago, they said that your mind is an exact representation of the entire galaxy. I mean, nowadays we have the internet. So we take photos of the galaxy, we take photos of our eyes, we take photos of the synapses in our brain, and we can go, wow, look at that. The galaxy looks just like the synapsal regions of my brain. But these are ideas that were not born in the internet era. These were ideas that have been going for thousands of years. And as I said, the first law of Hermetics, being one of the ancient training schools that they prepared these magician healers in, was that they taught them that all is mind, and that the mind that you are is a microcosm, a small representation of the mind that the entire universe is. Now, that is a huge thing to consider for just a moment, because we do really like to have this idea that we are sitting behind the walls of our eyes and we have no correlation to what is going on around us. And if you were to consider that, you can far more deeply understand where all of our religious stories have come from. Because if I am housing, if I am within me, I have a little part of everything in the universe expressing within me. That is how the stories of light and dark, and stories of God and the devil, and stories of the different components and archetypes that are war within a human being are born. And they're really, really powerful conversations. So we've just got this idea of the fact that our mind might actually be completely linked to the entire universe. I know that this is not theoretical for me. I experience this, but I simply, whenever I talk about something, I only want you to just entertain the idea. Now, why this whole conversation would be so interesting regarding the mind would be, for instance, there is this wonder how humanity and how you as a human being sitting staring at a screen and have created all of this around you. There is this conversation of the fact that we are random intelligence, which is so ridiculous. Only a system of absolute intelligence can create something that creates intelligence. It's so logical. Think about an acorn, okay? And you'll see what this has to do with us tackling the mind this evening. Think about an acorn. An acorn is not an oak tree, but inside an acorn, the intelligence of an entire tree is implied. Does that make sense? If you're holding an acorn in your hand, to say that accidentally an acorn tree one day comes from that holds and hosts lives for trillions of bacteria and birds and bees, and it's so silly to actually look at the acorn and go, the acorn implies intelligent life. And why I want you to consider that is we only know a little bit of the small reality that we're in. So I want you to consider that sitting right now, you are not separate to the Big Bang. If there was some form of inception, you are it in action right now. The body you are, the problems that you are, the conflicts that you are, is this expansive process in action right now. You are implied, just as the acorn has implied. exactly what you are going to become and what you are becoming, and the struggles that you are going through were written into that original movement. That's the simplest way I can put it. So there is not a single thing that you are dealing with that is not divinely implied. You are a part of a cosmic process. And I want you to just consider that. So for us to look at, if we approach this last period of our talk, we have to look at what does it take essentially to become the guardian of this gate in front of your mind. The first thing would have to be this exploration of, well, what are my thoughts? And that is something I am not going to be able to do for you. But it is a really, really interesting conversation, because I can tell you that a very, very large percentage of the population believes that that voice that they hear in their heads is essentially who they are. And of course, that can be really, really confusing, right? And part of awakening or becoming aware is starting to go, I must share something with you. It's a little bit off the subject, but I do feel that the fact that people think awakening is a big step. I think awakening is the first step, but I think that there is so much to do after that. And I think we're stuck in this awakening culture. Even 3,000 years ago, in certain Vedic texts, they spoke about these awakenings that you could have. Awakening was just to suddenly see things as it is. It didn't mean that it didn't imply enlightenment in any way. And I think we've all got that a little bit construed. We've got this idea of, oh, I'm definitely seeing things different to the average person. I must be enlightened. I feel even if enlightened, if there was such a thing, I don't know. I mean, I personally, I'm unsure about it. But I do feel like it takes a lot of work to become fully conscious with certain things, and not to impress other people, but to become peaceful for ourselves. So the question is, you start to realize after a while that there is definitely someone who thinks when I'm thinking. There is definitely a voice that has an opinion when I think certain things. I can think something really ugly, and another part of me can be upset that I'm thinking that. But then we also realize that there seems to be another layer as well. And this conversation is perhaps, I would call it, at the forefront of spiritual debates right now. And why this debate cannot really take place between people, I feel we can stimulate one another, is because the intangible cannot be made tangible. We are trying to describe things with words that cannot be described. But what I can tell you is that what most people know is that there is definitely a voice that seems to run automatically within your head. Now, it is quite a lonely and disturbing life if you believe that that is you. And what's fascinating is if you go across cultures and you go into, let's come into modern science, and you look in biology, there is a lot of elements of the fact that some people are beginning to argue that we are a hive mind. Now, this is a mind-blowing thing, because we watch ants marching and how they're all connected, and we watch bees and we watch all these creatures, and then we watch millions of kudu and impala, and we realize, and we watch birds, like 1 billion of them dancing and diving all in the same direction, and we sit here as human beings fascinated that they're all connected mentally. And this is not just a biological conversation, but as you know, many of our fathers of psychology and psychiatry suggested that there was definitely a single mind. Like, you do have an individual mind, but there is a single mind that we're tapping into. Why this conversation is so important is, I think that most people could agree, without us going too far into belief, which I'm very careful to try not to. I like to just stimulate ideas. I think it's fair to say that if we do have a hive mind, there is a little bit of an element that the hive mind is in a little bit of trouble, that we as a species are not at our highest point. I think that's a fair statement. So why this conversation becomes really important is, if we are all tapped into a single frequency, that each of our faces, as I look at you, we share something in common. If that frequency, or let's call it a radio station, if it doesn't exist, then explain this to me. How is it that I know how you all feel about your stomachs? How is it that we know how we all worry about certain things? How is it that we know how it is we feel about looks, about there's so many insecurities and egoic viruses that we are all sharing, to the point with when you do shadow work, it's absolutely incredible. We are all the spiritual beings trying so hard to look good that we are not making advances until we move into groups of people that are not trying to come across as enlightened. And when they truly, truly own the darkness within them, then the person next to them becomes so liberated. I've seen it so many times. One person going, look, I don't know what you fucking enlightened people are going on about. Like, it's my turn to share. I want to tell you guys something. I can't sleep at night. I'm scared. I'm anxious. I drink. Whatever it is that you do, I know that I am super conscious. I know that I'm highly aware, but I'm suffering. And that essentially what makes me so passionate about the conversation tonight. I believe that you can be hyper aware, super conscious, and deeply suffering at the same time. And truly, how does one even begin one's journey until you find peace? We had a conversation about the fact that trying to find happiness before peace just doesn't work that way. Happiness shows up in the garden of peace. So this conversation becomes very powerful. Now, if there is this hive mind, which Carlos Castaneda, for anyone who is a fan of his work, calls the predatory mind. He spoke about when he sits in big groups of people. Now, I would like to share that I actually experience this fully when I go to a mall. Not theoretically, I experience this. He sits amongst crowds of people and he can hear the hive mind whispering, the general consciousness of what is going on there. Now, Carlos, and you've got to decide what's empowering for your life, he took it as far as to feel that when that mind was in a lower frequency, he called it the predatory mind, because it would essentially choose to survive over you surviving. An example of that is where a lot of the teachings of the ego were born over the last 800 years. They used to use different words for it many thousands of years ago, because essentially the mind was still considered to be something different to what we think it is today. So it's been recontextualized. But I want you to just consider the fact that we all sitting in this room, there is a very distinct possibility that if Carlos Castaneda is correct, and many teachers are correct, that to actually begin to feel peaceful means that you actually have to revolt or go on a full case rebellion against your own mind. I want you to just consider that for a second. I want to give you a sentence. To feel powerful, to feel connected, and to feel uplifted is essentially a rebellious act, because the hive mind is at a certain frequency. We all know it is. We all know how to switch on the news. We all have friends. We are in constant fear. We are all worried about the same things, and we are so consumed. I mean, guys, it is fair to say that, have you ever noticed how many things are fighting for your attention at the moment? From advertising to everything wants your full attention. And I want you to just consider, in this war for your attention, that we are so consumed by these minuscule anxieties, or what you could call tangible anxieties, that we never get an opportunity to essentially try and look at what the intangible anxieties are. Let me put that in a more simple explanation for you. An example would be that the average person, even though for thousands of years, one of the first things you had to do spiritually was sort out how you felt about death and what you believed about death and how you were going to die, and how it is you're going to prepare spiritually for death. This has been in every shamanic culture in history. We are so preoccupied by the anxieties of the day, the tangible anxieties that are essentially possessing us, our cars, our salaries, the way our bodies look, what organizations we are members of, which belief systems we are going to allow to possess us, that we do not get to these big questions. What am I? You know, what am I? Most people go, yeah, of course I've asked that question. Have you? I mean, on the conversation of talking about death and why death had to come up, we did it in detail, is because essentially most people's anxiety attacks are actually linked to their death in some way. They have to get complete with that in some way. But what's a fascinating thing is we have this modern obsession, right? And what's the obsession? I've got to find myself. I've got to know who I am. I've got to express myself. Now, this seems theoretically really powerful, but what the truth of it is that just look around. We have a world of things completely expressing more and more uniquely with absolutely no thing uniting it in any way. We are like in the age of specialization. If you think about it, if there's something wrong with a specific part of your ear, you can go to a doctor that can literally be a specialist on 1 centimeter of your ear. This is an example of how fractured and specialized we've become. You can go to guys that are experts on absolutely anything, but almost nobody is holding the overall picture. For instance, you can go to a GP that looks at your general health. You can go to someone who looks at your brain. You can go, but like, who actually treats a human being? Now, what does this conversation have to do with your anxiety? When you go down the rabbit hole of what am I and who am I, these conversations become really important. If you have ever studied quantum physics and you think about this journey that we've taken for the last, I call it 80 to 90 years, this incredible thing of what is reality based on is not a separate conversation to who is speaking in my head. They are the same conversation, because essentially, if you think about it, there is something that appears to be there. But upon going closer and closer and closer and closer and closer, we eventually realize at the subatomic basement level that there is nothing there. That sometimes there's something there and sometimes there's not something there. And we discover that in physics, no matter how hard we try, we cannot find a building block of what things are made of, even though we originally believed that was the case. Now, your search for what you are and who the thinker is and who the anxiety is exactly the same. If your journey within takes you on this point where you essentially just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and what I mean by that is more and more sure, this is what I'm like, and I know what I'm like, and this is, and you become more and more specified in your individual imprint, then you are in a very different inner journey to most of the people I've ever met. Because the inner journey is one that is almost confusing for most. Because let's use Alan Watts, as the great Alan Watts said, if you travel down the basement of thought right to the actual basement, all you find is a mirror. And then there's mirrors within mirrors within mirrors. A lot of you have experienced this with psychedelic medicine, where you experience seeing thousands of eyes, or many of you have seen this in enlightened experiences of awakening, where you start feeling like everybody who's looking at you is you looking at yourself from a different direction. Now, the conversation becomes very important, because in the one, you decide that what's going on in your head is essentially you and needs to be protected. If you feel you are inside your mind and that is you that's having that conversation, you will have to protect and defend. This is very important. If that voice that's going inside your head, oh, my stomach looks funny, my voice is squeaky, I'm going to die, I'm scared to die, that constant narrative and radio station that's playing in every single human being's head simultaneously at the same time, louder and louder if you listen. And all that's changing is the varying degrees of just how much each and every one of us are buying into the story that's playing in our heads. Now, that's a very different reality to if you decide that what is playing in your head is simply an interface. It is simply the way that this beautiful being that you are gets to interface with inner reality and outer reality. If that is the case, you will find yourself laughing at some of the things that your mind says. You will find yourself not fighting to hold on to thought when you meditate or surf or go for a walk in the mountains, because it is only in the subsiding of thought that you can glimpse yourself for a while. The observer, the being that is always just there behind thought or behind anxiety, watching you wrestle with your stories. So the question of who the thinker is actually extremely important in the journey of healing anxiety. The one thing I want to do is I don't see, at this very moment, I don't see the time. Can someone signal on their hands for me what the time is? I don't know why mine's disappeared. Okay, can someone just, Johan, will you just unmute and let me know? 7:40.
It's like 5 minutes to 8.
Oh, 5 minutes to 8. Beautiful. Thank you, my brother. Thank you. So, yeah, this becomes an extremely important conversation about the fact that to plug into our species is essentially, it's like saying the hive mind is extremely perturbed. So it's not to disconnect yourself from human beings. This is important, guys. Have you guys noticed how any spiritual idea or anything in the world can be a medicine and a poison? An example is a lot of people in modern spirituality are trying desperately to divorce themselves from the mess that we've all purposely created. An example is you discover that you have parts of you that are emanating in other planets or other realities. What an exciting thing. It's good to jump into the fact that you're multidimensional, but the version of how we, for instance, use this to avoid our shame is then people say things like, oh, but this is not my mess, this is not my planet, I'm not really a human being, I'm just visiting here. And this is just a very simple example of everyone trying to find a way to divorce themselves from essentially, to me, is a single being that is us. So it's a very important thing to consider in the things that you believe. And we spoke about this potential rebellion. So what is this going to look like practically in your life if this is helpful to you in any way? Well, I can tell you what it is for me. It is realizing that I have had 1,000 conversations that were never going to happen in my head because I do not control my thoughts. It is allowing my mind to run at night. When my mind runs at night and I can't control it, the one tool I've given you that always works is that you essentially, if, for instance, you are worried about the fact that you might lose your job and it's tormenting you, one of the best things you can do is just sit down and do the shadow wolf process and call the wolf out and realize that you might lose your job. And if you did, you could cope with it. And as soon as you are willing to face that deep, dark fear, I'm going to die. I don't want to die. I'm probably going to be afraid when I die. And get yourself to the point of being okay with that thing. But the conversation at hand is the fact that you're going to have stories. I want you to be aware of this for the next few weeks, playing out inside your head. Now, you have no idea. Can you guys just all mute up for me? You guys have no idea how many levels of consciousness are available inside you. And I want to give you an example, okay? You're going to notice, for instance, that you have conversations about imaginary scenarios that never even happen. If you think I'm being very, let me be literal. For instance, someone says, I've really got to talk to you tomorrow. And you climb in bed at night And I tell you, within an hour and a half, you have been through every scenario possible. He found out that you stole his pencil when you were 16. You already figured out how you're going to defend. I got to the point where I began to understand the role that my mind was playing in my deep suffering, where, Johanna, I think it's yours. Will you just mute it up for me? Thank you. Where, for instance, I would be standing in the kitchen cooking, and I would go, "Stop it, man!" And my father would come running into the kitchen going, "What on earth was that?" I said, "No, I'm talking to myself." And I don't care how crazy it was. It got to the point where I developed a parent-child relationship with my mind. I got enough guidance from my inner world to realize to not make my mind the enemy, because a lot of the time my mind is just making suggestions for me. It's telling me not to run into a pole because it will hurt. It's telling me that I should eat because I'm hungry. And it's mostly just tapping into what the hive mind is saying, and it's updating you. So the mind kind of works a lot like that. It goes, "Gordon, I just want to let you know everybody's really worried about this thing that's happening." And then, of course, I get that suggestion in my mind. And what I get to do as a conscious individual is I get to decide how much of that I wish to take on board, how much of that I want to permeate into my own personal story. But I want you to be aware of the fact that your mind is constantly going to be suggesting things. I now kill myself laughing at my mind. Half of my humor and sarcasm comes from my interface with my mind. I do not perceive myself as my mind at all. And some of the things that my brain comes up with, I tell you, and I'm sure a lot of you know that there is also a higher mind. And that's a conversation for another day. But it is such a magnificent thing when you consider the type of things you talk and think about when you're in a low frequency. The monkey mind tends to obsess, and the monkey heart tends to cause obsession in the mind too, which would be if, for instance, you have unhealed trauma or unhealed pain, that can get your mind racing as well, because the monkey heart triggers the monkey mind. And there's a very interesting relationship between that somatically. But there is a higher mind, and the higher mind doesn't tell as many stories as the lower mind. The higher mind knows things instantly. The higher mind is the creative mind. And what's incredible is, I think the way I want to close before I open this into a discussion is I want you to consider that once you become the guardian of this gate of your mind, becoming aware of the stories, becoming aware, sometimes disciplining, as the great Manly P. Hall spoke about, the disciplining of the four lower bodies. The initiate has to discipline the four lower bodies. And I want you to consider that once you've done this higher mind, some people call it the higher self. It shows across nearly every spiritual tradition that you begin to anchor a higher mind. This higher mind, how would you know if it's beginning to happen? Well, there's a lot of really beautiful things that happens. The first thing is the higher mind is highly intuitive, isn't it? It has a very, very high level of intuition, and you would just know many things. But you would also begin to tell the difference between fearful thoughts. Because remember, what we do discover when we talk about the predatory mind is we do discover that before we get control of the mind, it mostly obsessively just suggests scary things to you, which is, wow, when you're in a difficult space, if any of you have ever really had a bad experience in your mind, from psychosis to a trip to a panic attack, the mind torments you. Do not believe that this is only your friend. If you believe it is you, then you need to just spend a little bit of time listening, and you'll notice that in your most desperate hours, it goes at you. And many, many people that you see in mental institutions or in drug rehabilitation houses, their mind is tearing them to pieces. And I do believe that until you get control and become the guardian of the mind, you cannot do any of the other things, because it is through a thought that you become disempowered. It doesn't matter how powerful your solar plexus are. It doesn't matter how powerful your heart is. If your mind goes, for instance, You know you can't do this, and you go, oh, fuck, I can't do this. It doesn't matter how much power you had waiting inside you. And it doesn't matter how much healing you do. If you allow your mind to rip at you and your mind goes, you do know that no one cares about you. You do know that this person is just betraying you. And it allows you to set yourself up. You do know that what that person does is personal. And then these new wounds all the time. The house is the rabid dog. The house of the mind is the rabid dog that needs to be taken control. And the legend is that you will bounce around in the little walls of your room, essentially, until you begin to control that rabid dog. And then you'll begin to expand. And you'll begin to then realize that you can think as your whole body, and eventually that you can think as the whole universe. What other things? Creativity, this higher mind. In the beginning, I experienced it and still experience it as two separate things. Wow, I'm really in a higher state right now. I'm so creative. I explode with ideas. It's easy to understand how cosmic things work, even though I can't explain them. And then when you're in a low vibration, I can't access those things anymore. And I'd be interested in your sharing if any of you are able to notice the difference between your